The radical right does not believe in a radical egalitarian society. They believe in supremacy
by the people
of the authentic members of the nation,
that was too far right.
whoever those
That was
happen
too
to be.
extreme.
And like I mentioned before, there are different ways you can decide who authentically belongs in the nation. It can be political like Mussolini, it can be racial like Hitler, it can be religious like Franco. By starting out with the dehumanizing language, by deciding that there are certain groups in society, kind of minority groups in society, successful minority groups in particular, that just don't really matter. And then the next thing you know, you've created the opportunity for people to take advantage of and accelerate this particular kind of violence that will not stay in a bottle. It's not going to, end up just attacking the Chabad. It's going to show up at Christmas celebrations. You're going to have cars driven through parades at Mardi Gras or whatever else.
Welcome to the podcast. My name is Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch, here with my co-host, attorney Lori Fein, and we have a very special guest today. His name is James Lindsay. He's a mathematician, author, and leading analyst of ideological extremism and cult-like movements. He's best known for his grievance studies affair, where he exposed how broken academic systems can reward ideology over truth. He's also the founder of a fantastic website called New Discourses, where he examines how political movements, both on the far left and the far right, can become driven by grievance, outrage, and authoritarian thinking. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get on to your trip to Israel, help us understand more about the term you've been using that you didn't coin, but use quite a bit, called the woke right. This kind of just exploded onto the scene when Tucker Carlson interviewed Nick Fuentes most recently. Nick Fuentes, for those of you who don't know him, is a vile anti-Semite, racist, and to me as a therapist looks like a sociopath. But help us understand what's going on today. What is woke right? And why is it so dangerous for the United States?
Yeah, so I'm glad you actually asked both of those questions. What is woke and what is woke right? Because this has been confusing for a lot of people. They hear woke, they think that's something to do with the left. Based on their experiences over the last 5 to 10 years, they hear right, they hear left, right, they get confused. And so it's been a very challenging thing because you have to actually understand woke as in terms of what it actually is doing, what people believe they've woke up to, in order to understand how there can be a woke on the right. So I'll start with the easier of the two words, which is right, which turns out to be a very hard word to define for people. We use these terms politically, left and right, just very casually. We say, okay, these people are the left, those people are the right. I don't want to get into a whole history lesson, but this all goes back, the naming convention is completely arbitrary. It goes back to the French Revolution. They were about to have the revolution. They were in the National Assembly. The king was in the middle. The monarchists and the conservatives sat to his right, and that's actually two different factions. The Jacobins, who wanted to take everything over and who did take everything over, sat to his left. Therefore, we call these factions left and right. So, I mean, we could elaborate for a very long time, but just to look at the Jacobins, they had both a political philosophy and a political position. So they had a belief that society should be organized in particular ways. We could say in modern American terms, higher taxes, more social programs, and so on. That's not what they envisioned. They had total control of society. But on the other hand, they also had a methodology, which was believing that they had woken up to the proper, true, rational organization of society that they were going to force everybody into through totalitarian means and terrorism. And we can say that both of those are leftist. And it's unfair to the people who just want higher taxes and more social programs. That's a political kind of belief position, but it's not a radical methodology. So that radical methodology confuses things. So when we look at the right, as it turns out, some of those people on the right, the radical monarchists and counter-revolutionaries, actually believed in a similar political methodology, although their position, what they wanted out of that methodology was completely different. And this has rung, it's kind of like a bell that rings periodically through history. You see it in the French Revolution, followed by the counter-revolutionaries. So you have the Red Terror, followed by the White Terror. Then you have it happening again in just to kind of fast forward through the entirety of the 19th century, but it certainly happens in the 20th century where you have the Marxist movements sweeping Europe, largely, driven by the Soviet Union. And you have these counter-revolutionary philosophies, these very radical philosophies, which kind of culminated in the fascism of Mussolini, the Nazism of Hitler, and the kind of military authoritarianism of Franco as counter movements to this push from the left. And so, what do we mean by right? Well, it can mean conservatives, but I don't think that that's the best way to use it. But it tends to mean people who have this kind of radical belief that we should very intentionally and deliberately structure society around some vision of what it means to be a member of the nation. Mussolini thought that if you're an Italian, you're an Italian. Hitler thought you had to have a racial characteristic to be a German, the Aryan. And then Franco wanted to reunite Spanish identity around Catholicism. So they had different models, but they want a very rigid, ordered, hierarchical society that's based off of something that looks vaguely like national tradition, as opposed to the radical egalitarianism that the left wants. They want everybody to be made equal, the equity program, as we call it. So we can understand, I've already made it complicated. What I do for left and right is people who say that they're on the right are on the right. People who say that they're on the left are on the left. It's a very simple understanding. But some of them have this radical orientation. They're woke about it. They aren't going into the debate hall and deciding to sit down and say, here's why we need this policy or that policy. Here's the rational arguments. They've left rationality behind entirely. Instead, they act almost as if they have a mandate from heaven to implement their politics, and everybody else is the problem if they won't get on board. And we're all kind of familiar with that. It takes the form of identity politics. It takes the form of critical theory in particular. And so for woke, the definition that I've been using since 2018, pulling it from their own literature, is that you're woke if you use critical theory to achieve your means. Critical theory means that you don't believe that there's any way to articulate an improvement to society on the terms of the existing society. So you have to throw out the entire existing society. And the way that you're going to do that is by criticizing everything that doesn't live up to some idealistic standard that you imagine or hold. And I say imagine or hold because if you have to know what it is to hold it, but you don't have to know what it is to kind of have it out in the imagination. So that's like a positive utopia where you can articulate what the vision's supposed to be versus a negative utopia where you don't know what heaven looks like, but there's no racism there. So we're going to go find every instance of racism in the world and smash it out. And so this negative utopianism is very typical of the critical theory approach. We don't know what a perfect society looks like, but there's no racism in it. So we're going to split the population into racists and anti-racists. The anti-racists are the good guys, and they're out and they're going to find every vestige of hidden racism and destroy it. We could get a lot deeper into what it means, but what the woke right refers to, what woke refers to is people who woke up to believing that this is what's going on in society. There's a power system that has made more progress impossible, whether that's progress toward radical egalitarianism or a rigid hierarchical society that doesn't have any, basically problems because we don't tolerate problems. So you have this radical vision for a perfect society, and you woke up to that we could have this if everybody would just get along with the program.
So, in other words, would you say that it's the combination of a utopian vision that is almost impossibly perfect with authoritarian means that are essentially willing to crush freedoms in order to get to this beautiful utopia that they envision?
I wish. It's not just authoritarian, though. It's always totalitarian. The belief is actually not that you're just going to force people to behave a certain way. You need them to think that way too. So it has to be a
It's interesting
totalizing
that
vision for
distinction
society.
between authoritarianism and totalitarianism that you're making.
Yeah, Franco didn't particularly care what Spaniards believed as long as they behaved. Hitler wanted everybody to understand the race ideology, the racial Weltanschauung that he had. And what happens the difference is that the authoritarian mind is only mad when people misbehave. The totalitarian mind is angry when people believe the wrong things or don't believe rightly or strongly
This
enough.
is
And
sort of
so
what Orwell got to and what Hannah Arendt identified
that's
when
right.
for totalitarian
So
studies.
the big key is when things don't work out, the authoritarian just tries to mobilize and force people to make things get better. The totalitarian identifies a scapegoat group that didn't believe correctly and initiates a purge. And that can be a
Which brings us
profound
to
purge.
anti-Semitism.
Yes, it could be definitely anti-Semitism, but like just to take kind of that out of the context, you can look at Mao in China. Not a lot of Jews in China in the 1950s, and basically everything that went wrong, it was that there was some faction in society that still held right-wing views, and so what he would say is 1 out of 1,000 people need to be are need to be found and rounded up and murdered, and another 2 out of 1,000 need to be sent to prison, and another 3 out of 1,000 need to be sent to work camps. And it didn't matter who the people were or what they believed. You had to find your quota, right? Because he believed that there were hidden bourgeois elements or right-wing elements or revisionist elements somewhere in society. And the belief in the totalitarian program is always that when it's not working, it's because there are insufficiently committed people in the population that are undermining it, that are sabotaging it. So those people have to be found and removed. And so they initiate purges like 1 out of 1,000 or 2 out of 1,000 of the population to scare the crap out of the other 999 of them, so that there are 995 of them or whatever it works out to, so that if they still have their bad views, they'll work harder, as Mao had it, to undergo their ideological remolding. That was the centerpiece. Criticism and self-criticism for ideological remolding was the centerpiece of the totalitarian system in China. And yes, in a mixed society, the first group that is typically scapegoated is one that is, on average, generally successful, that is not fully integrated. And it's almost always because there's just a historical template going back probably 3,000 years, Jews. There's a template for how to hate Jews that has been recycled over and over and over and over again throughout history. But but Jews also represent a fundamental break from basically all imperial thinking, and all totalitarian thinking is imperial. So they're an easy scapegoat group. They tend to be successful, and it's very easy to whip up a population against a successful, semi-integrated minority group during times of downward mobility or social and economic stress. So welcome to right now, I suppose, of explaining woke and woke right. But the short version
Well,
of,
yeah, let's make this really practical right now. On
yeah.
the left, we have people like AOC, Ilhan
Uh-huh.
Omar, the Democratic Socialists of America. On the more extreme right, which is a new phenomenon to most of us, because, I have to tell you something, most of us, traditional Jews and others, have moved towards the Republican Party over the
Mhm.
last few years. We're very supportive of Trump and the Republican Party. And many of us actually like Tucker Carlson and embraced Candace Owens. I remember when she came out a few years ago, I bought her book, Blackout or something like that. I was really impressed by her, what she was thinking, what she was saying. But suddenly there was this extreme turn to the far right that really none of us expected. And especially when Tucker Carlson brought in Nick Fuentes, this for me was just a watershed moment. This is bringing up literally memories of the early 1930s in Germany,
Mhm.
just before the push around 33. Hitler comes into power, and then we have what happens in 1939 to 1945. So, could you help us understand where this is coming from? Who planted the seed on the far right? Is there a certain economic incentivism here? Is this clickbait? I think Candace Owens uses it extremely effectively. Tucker Carlson is a little more nuanced. But could you help us, because you're really very knowledgeable in this, help us understand the language of Tucker Carlson and the language of Candace Owens, why it's so deceptive and so destructive.
So these two actually, in one way, and then Nick Fuentes in a second way, illustrate why these guys are woke, right? And we can talk about the incentives, which are unfortunately myriad and perverse. It could be as simple as people are paying them, like the suspicion that Tucker Carlson has some deal in Qatar, which most Americans call Qatar, and then it could be something like Candace Owens is very obviously working the algorithms and keeping people on the hook to come subscribe to her, paywalled podcast. So pay $5 and I'll tell you the information that I alluded to. So there are lots of incentives, but these Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens illustrate woke in the fact that so why are they woke right? Well, they're on the right. They want a apparently right-wing type of post-liberal society. They push for what look like family values, et cetera, even though they're kind of weird and distorted. I call these things pseudo-traditional values as opposed to truly traditional values. They have the appearance of being. But what makes them woke is there's this book I have called Critical Constructivism, which I call it the Book of Woke. It's written by an educator named Joe Kinchelow. Not one person on earth would mistake his politics. He is far left. He was a major education theorist. It's very clear what he's after. And he lays out in 2000, I guess, 5, he wrote this book, what it means to believe that the world works the way that he believes the world works, which I call woke, or we now call woke. And so one of the key factors of his view of the world is that there is an oppressive power structure in the world. And the way that it actually works to keep the insiders on the inside and the outsiders marginalized is that it controls what people are allowed to know. It doesn't tell them what they can and can't say. It contours how they're actually allowed to think before they even say. So the knowledge field, I'm trying to not use their specialized terminology, but the knowing field is contoured by systems of power that benefit the people who are at the center. Okay, so the bourgeois class, the whites, if it's critical race theory, the straight normal people, if it's the queer theory, and so on. And so therefore, beliefs, attitudes, ways of knowing, as they call them, that are marginalized are preferred. It's not that, an indigenous tribe somewhere has their set of superstitions and whatever else or practices for living and being. It's that they know things that we don't know because the power structure of our society won't let us know that stuff. So it's more likely that the things that they know are true and valuable as compared to the things that we take for granted, like, Western science or whatever. So
Just hiding all the good stuff in these
right.
obscure places.
So the key of woke thinking, or to be technical, woke epistemology, is that there is a preference for knowledge that is believed to be marginalized by the power structure.
Correct. And that's
Counter-hegemonic knowledge.
exactly what Candace Owens is doing, and Tucker Carlson.
That's right.
Like sacred texts, these certain slogans. I'm not supposed to talk about that. That's what Carlson, would
That's
say.
right.
They're not.
You're not supposed to talk about it. You're not allowed. They don't want us to talk about this. You're not allowed to say that the Jews run everything and that they got a space laser. Candace Owens is always like, the investigators have dug up this much about Charlie Kirk's murderer, but here's all these things about Egyptian planes that nobody's even talking about. So that outsider marginalized knowledge is preferred over the established knowledge. In other words, in technical language, the counter-hegemonic view is favored over the hegemonic view. That is absolutely definitional to what it means to think like a woke person. And so
now, how would you distinguish this from, for example, there's, broad-based suspicion of mainstream media, and one could say that it is a version of what you're saying, that being suspicious of the mainstream media and seeking out, for example, conservative voices that have been excluded from most of the media is another form of this. How are you distinguishing that from the extreme side that we were talking about?
Well, there's two pieces to the distinguishing. Number one is that there is a epistemological preference for outsider knowledge. So if you believe the mainstream media is lying and you seek out an alternative voice, to use the old Russian phrase, you would still trust but verify, right? So you wouldn't take it for granted that just because somebody's saying a naughty thing, that it must be true, right? If the difference is with woke thinking, the marginalized or externalized knowledge is preferred epistemologically. It's not that you have a personal preference that you think that, oh, I want to hear more of, whatever conservative podcaster rather than the CNN anchor. It is because this is outsider knowledge, it's more likely to be true. So there's this willingness to just believe it. The second is actually the more technical answer, which is the counter-hegemonic element. Woke thinking believes there is a corrupt power system controlling the knowledge field, and therefore anything that damages that is more likely to be true as well. It's not just outsider knowledge. What critical race theory, they don't just want to hear stories from racial minorities. They want to hear what are called counter stories. They want to hear stories that tear down your ability to believe in the existing establishment. So for Tucker Carlson, all of this, let's draw suspicion on America over the past, 100 years or longer. Let's draw suspicion on the truth of what happened in World War II as we all understand it and have understood it. It's one of the most historically analyzed periods that humanity has. But no, we're going to relitigate all that. So this
I'm
idea
sorry,
that
but to the point where Winston Churchill now is under suspicion as well, and Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. I mean, these were axioms that we basically you and I grew up with, and they want to
right.
change those axioms. Yeah.
So their view is that those axioms are in fact not necessarily true, but they've erected a field of power to where, the second somebody says, "Oh, you sound like a Nazi," it shuts down all possibility of further discussion. And so they believe they claim to believe, I don't know what Tucker believes. I know some of these people believe that this has set up a false religion of never again. And it has contoured politics to keep the further margins of the right wing out of respectable politics. They blame characters like William F. Buckley Jr. for having erected a conservative movement that did not include voices like theirs. And they
Well,
believe that they're
he
having,
expelled. I mean, there's a certain point he expelled that far right wing
that's
from the
right.
conservative movement, and
That's right.
therefore bringing in a bigger coalition under
But
the
they
conservative
believe that
movement.
this was an arbitrary move of power to basically erect a global system of the open society that will no longer tolerate this far right for arbitrary reasons. And in fact, worse than arbitrary reasons, because they're actually telling truths that are inconvenient to the power structure. So it can be the case that CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and everything else is lying to us constantly, that we find that they are untrustworthy sources. So we seek out alternative sources, but to believe that the alternative source is more likely to be telling you the truth, A, because it's marginalized voice, and therefore the more marginalized, the more true, and B, because it's attacking the power center itself. You could attack the power center with lies just as well as you could attack the power center with truths. So the mistake is that the outsider knowledge is epistemologically preferenced by virtue of the fact that it's outside and attacking the center. That's the hallmark of woke thinking. And I understand why it's hard for people to understand what's going on with this woke right, because now you have right wingers attacking what seems to be a visibly corrupt establishment. And it seems like that's probably legitimate. But the fact of the,
With grievance because of the what you call this downward mobility. This is the
that's right.
moment now to talk about it, correct?
So right, and that's the Nick Fuentes characteristic, because I said that Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson particularly feature the epistemological side. What Nick Fuentes particularly speaks into is the side of woke that grows out of alienation. And so if you read Karl Marx, you'll notice that he uses words like alienation and estrangement, like every couple of sentences, basically. It's all over the place. The whole thing is a theory of alienation. So what Nick Fuentes is actually successfully doing is speaking into an alienated population that feels like it doesn't have the opportunities either that it used to, or that it feels that it's entitled to for some reason. The inheritance that they believe that they were going to get is not there. And that sense of alienation is then in woke thinking. You can be alienated. There can be, bad circumstances that are unfair circumstances as well. But the goal, Karl Marx has a single sentence that I think is so indicative in the economic philosophic manuscripts. He says that supersession occurs as a result of the retraction of alienation into the self. So you're superseding your individual identity for a group-based identity based on the fact that you realize, aha, it's not that I'm having a bad time. It's that everybody who looks like me or comes from the same place I do or whatever is having a bad time because there's a system that's against people like me. So now you've removed personal agency from failure and you've outsourced it into group thinking, and they call this supersession of the self. So this is the adoption of that group-based identity politics, which in its earlier forms doesn't necessarily have a positive exposition like white supremacy. It will have, in fact, at first, usually negative expositions, which is the damn Jews or the damn blacks or the damn whoever have ruined all of our opportunities. And who are the our in this in that reference? What's the antecedent to that pronoun? And the answer is whites eventually. And so you get usually the scapegoating outward blame first, followed by the positive identification with your own identity group. And if we were doing that based on an identity based in economic class structure, we would call it class consciousness, because that's exactly what Marx meant by class consciousness. But we're not. We're now doing it with regard to characteristics of demographic identity. So he's speaking into the alienation.
Like, for example, like the immigrants feeling the otherness, and now the white man in North America now also feeling the otherness. Is that correct?
And in fact, amplifying that feeling of otherness and having been cheated as a result of it. So, for example, the far left believes in a radically egalitarian or perfectly equal manufactured equality society. Actual equality is what the Soviets actually called it. And so we're going to have an actually equal society. The actual means, by the way, in dialectical language, that it's been manufactured to be that way. So we're going to have an actually equal society. That's the vision. And so racial minorities in the critical race theory model have been excluded from actual equality by systematic forces of white supremacy. So therefore, there's a system of racism that's keeping all of these people out, regardless of success stories like Michael Jordan or Oprah Winfrey or whoever else you want. As a group, they're still alienated from the full participation in society. And therefore, you have to overthrow the apple cart. The radical right does not believe in a radical egalitarian society. They believe in supremacy of the authentic members of the nation, whoever those happen to be. And like I mentioned before, there are different ways you can decide who authentically belongs in the nation. It can be political like Mussolini, it can be racial like Hitler, it can be religious like Franco, or some mixture of those things, which is kind of what's happening in the US. And so they don't want a radically egalitarian society. They want a radically structured society. They believe that the problem isn't inequality, but tolerance. We've tolerated people we shouldn't have, and that's contaminated our people who were successful until the contaminants ruined everything. So now we're going to be radically intolerant. And that is the alienation that Nick Fuentes speaks into. And what it produces is a belief that that which is outside of the corrupt structure must be more valid. It must be more valuable. And so you can link the two pieces pretty cleanly that way. But Fuentes is speaking into alienation. Tucker speaks some into alienation. Candace is playing a game where it's just straight up. They're not telling us the whole story. There's a corrupt evil they. They're not saying everything they know. I've used Google and misread time zone charts and don't understand flight itineraries and have figured it out for you. So I mean, I joke, but this is why these three characters are sort of avatars of this woke right ideology.
Right. And let me ask you, I'm going to speak to you as a therapist right now, studying personality disorders and what we call cluster B personality disorders. I'm noticing what Freud would call splitting here, extreme thinking. I'm also noticing some histrionics going on. I'm noticing this more with Candace Owens.
Yes.
I'm getting the sensation as I sit with the client of histrionics right now, gaslighting. It's a real personality disorder. I don't pick that up on Tucker Carlson. He seems much more organized. Let's talk about Candace Owens. Do I have something here about cluster B disorders right now?
Yeah, I think she's, I mean, I'm not qualified to say she's a textbook case, but it looks like it. I'm not unfamiliar with these disorders. And I agree, borderline and histrionic are the ones that seem to stand out the most. Her behavior seems to match that. The attention seeking, the willingness to engage in social brinkmanship, destroy relationships, and so on in order to gain advantage. It looks very much like that. I actually think that a lot of these extremist ideologies, and I had this conversation with Jordan Peterson back in the spring when he was still well on camera, so people can watch it. And I think that these ideologies, these radical ideologies, are very frequently structured around satisfying the whims and wants of cluster B or other, as you know, Dr. Peterson prefers the dark tetrad model, but however,
Yes, the dark
uh,
tetramal, yes.
but these cluster B personality
Sociopathy,
disorders.
Machiavellianism, and yeah.
Right. And so I think that that's actually correct. I think that that is what we're largely seeing in those kinds of manipulations and like you said, the gaslighting, the infamous Darvo, deny, attack, reverse roles of victim and offender to try to pin everything on anybody but themselves, the complete externalization of the locus of control onto everybody else who's now victimizing them. I think that this is what's at the bottom of it. And I agree. Tucker is more
But
organized.
Morgan,
Um,
so where did he break? Where did this happen? I remember he was a pretty decent journalist, and he's a little bit on the controversial side over the years. But to go so extreme is there an economic advantage to this, or was this a conscious decision, or how did he
I
break
wish
so
I
quickly?
I
You
wish
wish
I
you knew.
knew why he's gone so far so fast. His
So
politics
far,
have
so good.
always been different from MAGA's. And of course, there were the infamous leaked text messages from his lawsuit when he was leaving Fox, where was talking about how much he disliked Trump, just to put it very politely. And Tucker Carlson has a political motivation outside of anything else, which is that he is a paleoconservative in the vein of Pat Buchanan. He believes in this more, we'll call it muscular or aggressive right-wing political thinking, much more isolationist, nativist, suspicious of the outsider or the other kind of politics. And my guess, and this is mostly a guess, is that in the Obama years, Tucker Carlson saw an opportunity for a radical reorganization of the Republican Party following Obama, and that maybe we're going to break free of these establishment Republicans, as they're frequently called, and be able to re-inject a paleo-conservative or Pat Buchanan flavored right wing back into American politics. And he's had this streak going way, way back. And so he's been open about this, decades ago. And so, okay, so he sees this opportunity. Then Trump comes down the escalator with this very middle of the road in many ways, very pro-America vision that he calls MAGA, Make America Great Again. It's very pragmatically oriented. He flirts with some of that Buchananite rhetoric without ever going full Pat Buchanan. There were videos of Trump just absolutely being viciously critical of Pat Buchanan that float around. So he knows who he is, and he knows he's not going to go that whole direction. He even I forget what he actually says. I'm talking to Jay Leno on the Tonight Show, but I think it's something like he's having an open love affair with the Third Reich or something like that. He accused Pat Buchanan of at one point in the 90s. We could check the tape and find out what he really said, but that's the gist. And so Tucker Carlson sees in Donald Trump and the MAGA movement a complete theft of a political opportunity to take the politics to this more, what we called at the time, alt-right direction, and it gets subsumed in this monstrous movement, not in the sense of it being bad, but in the sense of a size, scope, energy. MAGA took over everything in conservative politics, just absolutely swallowed the whole. And so now there's no other alternative but to get on board with the MAGA agenda. So he has to subordinate his own desires again. He has to squash it down through the entire first term. Then he's hoping there's not going to be a second term, as the text messages revealed, up to the point where a lot of people don't remember this. In 2019, at the beginning of the year, Tucker Carlson was out advocating for Elizabeth Warren's economic policy over Trump's, and was saying that he doesn't like her woke identity politics, but he does like her economic politics. And this turns into a gigantic kind of back and forth, as it turns out, through the entire year of 2019, hashing out economic policy. So this again indicates a strong difference in policy preference from Tucker Carlson versus the MAGA movement in the Republican
Buchanan,
Party.
we'll call it Buchananism,
Yeah,
basically.
well, I mean, even the people I call woke right have argued with me. They said we're not the woke right, we're the Buchanan right. So
Correct.
they
Yes.
identify with that movement. And Tucker was kind of ahead of it. And it turns out that the person, when this argument kind of flared up over Elizabeth Warren's economic policies, which she called, it was a policy she put forth in
It's called
Congress.
I would like to have a $10 million mansion in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I would like the rest of you to please pay taxes so I can get it.
Yeah, but she put forth a law in 2018 that did not pass. That was the something Capitalism Act. It was like it has one of those buzzwords, like it's not Sustainable Capitalism Act, but it's something like this. And so Tucker loved it. And then Ben Shapiro shot it down using basically Friedman style economic arguments. And then the guy who comes to Tucker's rescue, of all people, is J.D. Vance, and is also arguing for basically that the free market economic system has failed America, has failed Americans in particular. And he says that's what Hillbilly Elegy is really about. That's why he's a politician. And we need an economy that works for the people. And I'm just bringing that up to point out that there has been this is 2019, so there's this very long running streak of difference to MAGA and MAGA's approach to things that Tucker Carlson has been swallowing for many years, seeing his opportunity maybe stolen from him by Donald Trump. And so what we're in now is Donald Trump's final term in office. So it's an opportunity to take the gloves off, lay down the railroad tracks so that whatever the Republican Party looks like after Trump is the Pat Buchanan paleo-conservative woke right variant, the alt-right of 10 years ago. It's to
Which
make
I'm
sure.
not sure. And
think
this, I want
that
to bring up this. I'm very concerned right now because I'm a Republican, I'm very concerned right now. If that wing takes over, I don't see them winning in the
They can't
future, in
win.
the
No,
near future.
absolutely
They
not.
can't, they can't take that middle, which Trump was able to bring in, open up the tent a little bit. And it's very concerning right now. So what would you say is us as podcasters, as spokespeople fighting for values and this middle of the country? How do we speak out against this? What's our role in this? You're speaking out against this. What should other people be doing as well right now?
It's funny. I get asked all the time, and I feel like I'm having the most success in the world, but maybe it's just a difficult phase. I think it's incumbent upon us to tell the truth and to tell the truth about our values and why our values that we as, Americans first, conservatives second, are actually broadly winning values. The reason that MAGA was so successful is because it did speak to that huge middle, even with the crazy, divisive, polarizing figure of Donald Trump, who's very likable once you kind of understand him, but he's very unlikable till you kind of understand him. So I think we need to speak about our values and why those values are winning, why
Yes.
those are a center of gravity for a very successful, very American, very broad-based popular movement. I agree, for example, and to use the kind of words of the day, that what we need is a big tent like the one that Charlie Kirk was maintaining. I just believe that Charlie
Yes.
Kirk was trying to he had the width of the tent correct, but he had the placement of the tent incorrect. It was including Tucker Carlson and excluding Barry Weiss, for example. And I think that we need the tent to
The
be
middle.
a little bit less to that extreme and a little bit more of that sensible middle who kind of, rides on the edge and goes policy by policy. But I think that that what we need to do in order to do that, it's very nice and easy to point at somebody doing something bad and get your head around it and start to explain why it's bad. It's so much more attractive and successful to propose the alternative model for how we should orient our lives. And what we actually, if we want to be successful, what we need to do, and I mean successful not just as a political movement, but as a country, as a people with a future, is that we've got to reach into the younger generations with the fact of these values being the right values, not just winning values, but values that when you build your life around them, things get better. You'll be more successful in your personal life, your communities will be better. Of course, I think this is part of why they've demonized the Jews in Israel so much, because there's a huge model for that in both. I mean, it's not an identical community, but in both settings, Jewish conservatives, observant Jews, and more seriously religious Jews exemplify almost all of these values, organize their entire lives and communities around them, and live that. And then when you go to Israel, of course, it's a little politically complicated over there, But when you see the, again, the more observant and basically the model could be like Jerusalem versus Tel Aviv. When you see the
I've
Jerusalem
been saying that
model,
for years. Two different
uh,
countries almost. Yeah.
almost, yeah, I went to Tel Aviv when I was there, and I was like, after a week in Jerusalem, I'm like, what are all these damn secular people doing? But
Well,
anyway,
I think that the unifying fact in Israel is that across the board, whether you're in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you still have commitment to family. You have the
yeah,
largest families in any Western country, the most children per family. You have a lot of the family values that we think of as sort of conservative, even the people who are on the left and the most secular Israelis who adopt the least of Jewish religious values still maintain those Jewish cultural values because they're in a Jewish country, and those are and that commitment to family, community, your army buddies, what have you, your country, fighting for your country, that is all still there no matter where people fall on the religious spectrum in Israel.
yeah, I agree. The second thing I noticed in Israel, and it's of course not everybody, very famously with October 7th, there was the awakening to the conception. But and some of those kind of more progressive people in the kibbutzes paid a very heavy price for their optimism and maybe naivety. But generally, at least with the people that I spent time with when I was there, and I feel like I see even in Instagram reels are propagandizing me to come back to Israel all the time now. There's a greater degree of realism about the world, and I think it's because even if you're on the far, you know, we'll just say hippie left, the threat across your borders is just right there and real, and there's no denying that it's right there and
Right.
real. So that forces you to stay a little bit more realistic. Like Nick Fuentes can run his mouth because he doesn't face any serious threat, and you
Threats.
can talk very abstractly about things that aren't present in your, like, political or your geographical neighborhood or even your literal neighborhood in some cases. So the family thing and the realism thing, I think, are the key things that I noticed in Israel about that. And the family kills me. You have all these, so-called traditionalist guys over here on the far right, and they all say the same thing that, family is the cornerstone of, a thriving society. It is the simplest form and the first form of governance. It is the model for, whatever. It is the fundamental unit of society. They have these different things they say about it, but they don't live that way. They spend all their time yelling at people online. They're not spending time with their family. They're mad that Charlie Kirk advised people to observe the Sabbath and
Keep
spend
the
that with their
Sabbath. His
family.
book just came out. Yeah.
That's right. And they got very upset that Erica Kirk came out and said Shabbat Shalom. But the context in which she said it was that Charlie would come home on Friday evening, throw his phone into a drawer and shut it, say Shabbat Shalom, and now it was family time for an hour or for a day. I mean, not an hour, a day. And it was this complete reset of everything, all their values, their mentality, the focus on the family for that 24-hour-ish period was such a big deal for them. So she said that Charlie would say that, and then these guys got mad on the internet. And so you see this, and you have, of course, then you go to the most extreme. You have Nick Fuentes running around yelling that having a family is gay, which it's quite literally the opposite, as fundamentally literally the opposite as it could possibly be. And so, he's just had a rant the other day that went viral talking about how, men should not aspire to be fathers. And so there's this very peculiar lie at the heart of the entire thing that is being pushed on this radical right that denies the thing they claim to be for. But again, it's uncanny for people that, they say if you go, it's uncanny when you go to Israel, at least for the first time as an American, just how family centered everything is. You go to a prestigious business meeting or whatever, even with a member of Knesset or something like this, and then everybody does, the little roundtable 5-second introduction of themselves. And the thing that they don't tell you their job, their accomplishment, what they do, they tell you how many children they have. Like number one, and then it's like, oh yeah,
That's
and like
fascinating.
I have 7 kids. Oh yeah, I'm also in the Knesset or whatever. I'm also president. Something like that. And it's
Well,
it's
let me ask you another question because we've just witnessed the last 2 years since October 7th, with a, volcano of propaganda against Israel and the Jews. I mean, I've never seen none of us have seen anything like this in our lifetime. And you just based in it for years and months, and every few seconds on the internet, whether it's TikTok or Instagram. And then you, James, go to Israel and you get out in Ben Gurion Airport. It's this beautiful, nice airport, and the highways are nice and clean and pretty open most of the time. And you start traveling the country and you see Jews and Arabs living together peacefully. You see Arabs in the Knesset, not all pro-Israel, but some of them are kind of pro-Israel. Arab people, Muslims that are doctors, lawyers, accountants, fully integrated into society. You see this wonderful, peaceful, really nice society. What were you thinking at that point? After all this propaganda, like what? It was like the Matrix, like the movie. Like, did you feel you were coming out of the Matrix or something?
Yeah, that's actually not a bad, it's not a bad analogy. And it got to the point where just a few days into my time in Israel, 3 or 4 days in, that I would open my phone, in the morning and I'd flip through to see what was going on in the world and answer my messages or whatever. And I'd look at social media and I'd see this, as you described it, lava flow, this volcanic eruption of propaganda against Israel. And I'm just like, after 3 or 4 days, I couldn't figure out what these people were talking about. It was so opposite to reality that it just stopped making sense. The things that they were talking about were just unrecognizable. And so, yeah, at one point I went with Jay Richards from Heritage Foundation was with me on my trip, and I went with him down to in the old city of Jerusalem. We went down to the Via Dolorosa, the Via Dolorosa, where Jesus carried the cross up the street. He's a Catholic, so it was meaningful to him and important. I thought it'd be cool to see it historically. Learned that was one heck of a hill that cross got dragged up. That was not a comfortable walk. So anyway, we go down there and we take a picture, and I put it on the internet kind of almost immediately. And within a few minutes, I mean, we're in the car going to the next thing, not that long later, half an hour later, an hour later. And I have this comment. It was like, I dare you to visibly wear a cross on, the outside of your shirt and see how you get treated in Israel. And all I could think, and I put it on X, actually, I replied, all I could think was they'd probably feed me and like wish me a nice day. Like I'm almost
Yeah.
positive food would be involved, and I might even not have to pay for it. Like I'm probably going to get some kind of a pretzel or a roll or something. And like, what are you talking about? Jay, first of all, Jay is Christian. And it's like we experienced no problem. We had, Christian taxi drivers. We were like, what's it like to be a Christian here? And he was like, well, we're a minority, but it's not that hard. And just consistently. And so, yeah, it is like stepping out of the matrix. I want to contextualize something. I see this volcano of propaganda after October 7th slightly differently than a lot of people do. I think that the propaganda push was long prepared. So the October 7th was an initiating event in a longer operation that includes all of the propaganda that we've experienced, including from Candace Owens starting on October 8th, along with the left, by the way, going after Israel.
I mean, I
And
think a lot of people have seen that there was such a coordinated effort. I mean, I'm very involved at Harvard, and the 33 student groups within hours had made a joint statement, and that
Mhm.
doesn't happen.
No. And so, I mean, I said it, I said it, I think on October 8th. I know I said it to somebody, but I don't think I said it publicly, but I might have. But certainly within a couple of days, I was already calling what was going on Gaza Floyd. So, the October 7th attack happens. Obviously, Israel's going to defend itself. So you can see this like criminal George Floyd does something, the police show up. And all of a sudden, the videos are all going to be these propaganda videos of the poor Gazans, the poor Palestinians, blah, blah,
Well,
blah,
during
the
during during
propaganda push.
Floyd, I mean, if you understand, go back a few years when the Floyd thing happened, we noticed that there were Palestinian demonstrators with the BLM on the streets. I mean,
Hmm.
that was kind of the inkling to what would happen in October 7th
I
as
mean,
well.
they've written about this for years and years, like decades, going back to the 60s and the 70s. You had the radical groups in the US that are the precursors to all of this, having gone over and trained in Palestine to learn the techniques as they described it to Palestine. I don't know where exactly they went, but probably Gaza, but maybe somewhere else. I don't know for sure where they went. But they talked openly about being radicalized and trained as agitators and propagandists there going way back. So absolutely. But I knew what was going to happen like immediately was that the Israel defending itself or trying to get its hostages back in particular, but also initiating that war, was going to be treated by these left-wing student groups, the left-wing affiliated media, etc., as a humongous George Floyd style propaganda push to make out the Gazans and the Palestinians to be the victim, and evil Israel is like the bad cop with his knee on George Floyd's back. And so that was going to be the prototype. And this is, rather than lasting most of the rest of that year, has now dragged on for over 2 years and has seemed to gain speed. What I did not predict in my first utterance of Gaza Floyd was that the right wing would also join in. But then Candace Owens started her crap pretty much I think it was on October 8th. We could double check, but certainly within the first week. And then I thought, oh no, all of this, because I'd been watching the rising anti-Semitism in various currents on the radical right going back to early 2021. And I thought to myself, oh no, both sides are going to do it and they're going to go full blast. The right side had to be more careful in how it initiated the attack, but at that point I realized we're going to be caught in a gigantic scissor operation, and it's almost like Israel's going to be the excuse to have moved the blades, but it's not really the issue.
And I'll tell you something else. This language from the right, I don't feel as threatened by it. I don't think there's going to be concentration camps on the right here any moment. But I can tell you something that they have to understand immediately, that these words end up killing people. The father and son pair that just did this ISIS attack in Bondi, these weren't people with mental illness. These were people that were very ideologically driven, highly trained. It's been said, maybe perhaps in the Philippines. There's a lot of rhetoric around the world which kills Jews. That's why we're so terrified. And that's why people have to stop it immediately, because they don't understand. I think there's a lot of clickbait going on and there's incentivization here, but this is extremely dangerous. This turns into Bondi. I
That's
can
right.
show you the steps. In a few steps, you go from this radicalization online, Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson rhetoric, and the AOC Ilhan Omar rhetoric, the Benjamin's baby, and it turns out to murdering Jews. So we really understand this and that's why people are speaking out against it. And that's why we thank you for doing what you're doing, because few people are articulating, but I just want you to appreciate how dangerous it is on a real visceral level for us right now.
No, I think about that actually pretty much all the time because I'm pretty frustrated, and I think, maybe I'm just going to take a break. I'm really frustrated sometimes with how I said on Twitter, it was very popular the other day. I said something like, it's very frustrating or very awful or something to watch the easiest moral test in 75 years, to just watch so many people fail it. And so sometimes I think, I just got to step back. I got to take a break, whatever. And then I think, well, I can do that because nobody's going to try to shoot me because I happen to go to like synagogue or, something like that. But then on the other hand, because we're dealing with jihad, we're not just dealing with attacks on Jews. You're seeing the attacks on Christmas markets. You're seeing attacks on Christians. They're not real keen on atheists or non-believers or agnostics either. And that this is a real
I don't like
threat.
brown students either.
No, well, no. And in particular, there were reasons to believe, at least that study session was one for a econ class that was run by one of the few remaining pro-Jewish professors, pro-Israel professors. What the targeting was, nobody knows, because it seems like defund the police completely turned the entire, not just Brown police, but the entire state of Rhode Island and all of its police forces into Keystone Cops or something like that.
Unbelievable.
Um,
Unbelievable.
so
I actually think I'm not one who usually goes in for conspiracy, but the idea that there really are no films in the entire state that could pin this,
it's very
seems
suspicious.
very,
It
it
seems
seems very
very
hard to believe
It
that
seems
something is
very,
not being
I
hidden.
agree with you. Yeah, so you're right. And Jews are going to be a frontline target, maybe the frontline target. I want to add though that like sentiment toward South Asians in the United States is not much better because again, you have a successful minority that only semi-integrates in the middle of, economic, not downturn, but contraction. And they are also being targeted. The H-1B visa debate was manufactured to create a ton of anti-Indian sentiment that was channeled directly into that. I have seen reports that the anti-Indian sentiment, particularly around that, where it turned into straight anti-Indian racist sentiment, was heavily stoked by foreign actors, particularly actors in Russia and Pakistan. And so manipulating the American conservative political scene to be anti-Indian. So Jews are the kind of easiest target for them to scapegoat and get away with in some sense. But then there are going to be others, and then that's going to snowball.
And we just saw, and Nick Fuentes just opened up his mouth against JD Vance's wife.
as
You
he
see the attack. Yeah.
as he tends to do, and JD Vance, for reasons beyond
Didn't
my
say
full
anything.
comprehension, will not say anything. Yeah. And this is this is a very dangerous moment. You're absolutely correct. This kind of rhetoric spills over into not just lone wolf crazy people who decide to go do something violent, but organized crazy people believing that they have the permission structures to be able to not
The green
necessarily get
light.
away with it on an individual
Yeah.
level, but rather to advance the cause by undertaking these kinds of actions. Like we're hearing, of course, on the back end of this attack in Australia, what we're hearing on the back end is, oh, well, maybe the Mossad set it up. Maybe it was a false flag. Oh, look, Benjamin Netanyahu made a speech saying this Western anti-Semitism has to stop. It was obviously a false flag, blah, blah, blah. And so the rhetoric, like you said, just accelerates. But the radicals participating in those attacks, who are not disordered lone wolf characters, like you said, understand that there is a societal permission structure that advances the cause through those radical actions, rather than the act of violence being the moment where everybody kind of wakes up and says, wait, what are we doing? We have to stop. So this rhetoric feeds that circumstance, and that circumstance is where you end up getting into very, very, very dangerous situations very quickly. And so I share that concern, and I agree that what we need, again, particularly young conservatives in America, need to realize that they are playing with some very dangerous fire that will also scorch them as it goes further down the line.
Could you please articulate specifically for young non-Jewish Christian conservatives why this is equally dangerous for them? What will the world look like? What will the United States look like in a few years if these ideas continue to foster and take over the Republican Party?
Well, I wish
How will
that they
they
would look
lose?
at, I mean, look at some of these other countries. For example, Britain or France or Germany to a pretty significant degree. Australia is very on the mind. Canada, they're now, I think, rightly saying that a attack like we saw in Australia is virtually guaranteed and imminent. So what you're going to find is that this kind of indiscriminate target, well, it will be discriminate targeting at first, primarily of Jews, and they might think, well, who cares? I'm not a Jew, right? But what's going to happen is it's going to expand. In Paris, they're not having their Christmas markets. They're not having some of the Christmas celebrations. They're not having the New Year's celebration. So now you have both a Christian oriented, but also societal wide celebration and a secular societal wide celebration, Christmas and New Year, that are facing being canceled because the security situation has deteriorated as far as it has. And what it's difficult to understand, I think, with a lot of these young people is they say, no, no, that's because Europe is so left and we're not left, so we're not going to be permissive of this. But that's not how this logic works. The logic works kind of very directly by starting out with the dehumanizing language, by deciding that there are certain groups in society, kind of minority groups in society, successful minority groups in particular, that just don't really matter. And then the next thing you know, you've created the opportunity for people to take advantage of and accelerate this particular kind of violence that will not stay in a bottle. It's not going to, end up just attacking the Chabad. It's going to show up at Christmas celebrations. You're going to have cars driven through parades at Mardi Gras or whatever else.
Or
Uh,
Times Square, or as we saw in California, was targeted around the city. It doesn't stop with it's like that Neil Meyer saying, first they came for the Jews and I didn't protest because I was not a Jew, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah.
But eventually they come for everyone else.
I was just say, to the degree that this is jihad, everybody who's not a adequately radical Muslim is targeted.
Indeed. And I hope that, one of my biggest concerns is that the sort of the tastemakers, the influence, the historical influencers of society, such as the media and academia, have not seemed to, not to use the wrong word, woken up to the fact that much of what is being taught and propagated right within the media and academia is in fact deliberate propaganda, as you say. It's planned, it's paid for from abroad, and it is completely intentional to have the impact that it's having. And unless I think these, what I would say, normal people who have traditional values, reasonable values, grow to understand that there is a deliberate attempt to change their viewpoints and to utilize their tolerance in order to get these jihadi or radical views across, I think that we're going to have a very hard time stopping it.
Yeah, people don't understand that the logic here is there are people for some set of reasons that many, maybe not a majority, but many people think it's perfectly fine to target. What you end up with is a rapidly deteriorating situation where nobody can be secured. On the one hand, you either introduce security measures that rob everybody of their freedoms and create a counter-revolutionary terror regime to control it, or on the other hand, it's too permissive and the attack vector expands. The necessary value has to be that nobody deserves to be targeted for effectively arbitrary reasons, for their identity, for their, non-radical beliefs. I leave lots of room for criticizing radical beliefs, but people who are just living their lives, if you find excuses for why it's okay for them to be targeted, it's only a matter of time until it's okay to target you. And I think that people need to realize that now that this is actually spilling into violence and that violence seems to be accelerating, that it is long past time that everybody take it much more seriously than they have been. It's all very nice and abstract to say, get on your podcast and say, well, maybe Jews do run everything. It's all very nice until things like we see happening are happening. And it's not nice, obviously, but it's sort of it's ephemeral until it's real, and it's becoming very real right now, and it's no longer, it shouldn't have been tolerable in the first place, but it's no longer, there's no countenance left to say it doesn't really matter if Nick Fuentes rants about the Jews. It does matter, actually, because it creates these conditions where increasing numbers of people believe they can get away with it, advance their agendas through it, or believe that it maybe even that is justified. We have a major growing problem, and just look around at every society that decides that you can target groups of people like this. They all go bad. They all go bad very fast. And our internal problems become so big that we can't deal with external problems when we get in that kind of a situation. It's just a nightmare.
Well, James, it has been an absolute pleasure, and it is reassuring that someone with your insight and your impact has taken up this cause. So I hope you won't be too frustrated to continue. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.